Welcome back to our video podcast for Harbor Online Community, where we share a bit about what we've been talking about on our Thursday nights. We are in week 2 of a series that we are doing through the season of Lent on the experience of being in the wilderness. And over these first weeks, we're particularly looking at the story of Hagar and her interaction with Sarah and Abraham, particularly listening to womanist theologians. And so, John, you shared some stuff with us last night. Why don't you give us a summary of what you worked on?
Yeah, thanks, Don. We looked at the second of 2 episodes in Hagar's life, and I'll note the way that I did at the meeting. Hagar. There are many, many ways to pronounce some of these biblical names, and we're all just going to say whatever we were taught or, sounds right to us. But we looked at the second of 2 episodes. This is a really dramatic story where Hagar is expelled by Abraham and Sarah. Now there's too much tension and conflict in the family, and particularly between Sarah and Hagar and their 2 sons. So Hagar and Ishmael, who is a baby, are sent into the wilderness with a skin of water and a little bit of food. And it's a heartbreaking story. Their food and water run out very quickly, and they're about to die. And Hagar can't bear to be looking at her son as her son dies. So she hides him under a bush and looks away. And God hears them crying and has compassion, and an angel appears and basically opens Hagar's eyes to see a well of water that probably was there already in this story, but maybe was miraculously brought into existence. But allows Hagar to see a well, and she goes and gets water, gives water to Ishmael, drinks it herself, and they survive. And they not only survive that moment of crisis, they go on to lead fruitful lives. Ishmael grows up to be an archer. They find an Egyptian wife for him, and which is their home culture, and they grow up and start a whole people group. And so that's the story we looked at, and we really interpreted it with the help of Dolores Williams, pioneering womanist theologian from last century. And she has incredible insights on Hagar's story, on this passage in particular. So just a couple brief highlights from that exploration of Dolores Williams and this passage. One thing that Williams brings to our attention is this tension between her own reading of the text as a Black woman and the typical Black liberation theology readings of Scripture and the theological emphases of those different readings. Black liberation theology, as its name would indicate, tends to look to God as the liberator, bringing freedom to the oppressed people. Whereas in Dolores Williams reading this passage, she notes God doesn't liberate in this story. What God does is comes alongside Hagar, companioning with her, giving her vision to see survival resources. She then takes the initiative to act on that, what God is providing, to both survive and to work toward her own liberation, her own quality of life for her and her son. So the emphasis is much more on survival and quality of life rather than liberation as a divine gift. And that was the basis of our conversation. I think we talked about wilderness experiences, as Dolores Williams describes them. We talked about what's going on in this Hagar story, with God and the angel and Hagar and Ishmael, and just brought some of our own stories into it, our own experiences of wilderness, survival, quality of life. And so, yeah, it was a cool conversation, but was really grateful for the theology we got a chance to look at and the insights that people shared on the call.
Yeah, thank you. It was a really, both these weeks I think have been really powerful in touching on our own experiences of wilderness, for those of us who may have had to leave a church, and for some of us it's an issue of survival and quality of life. So one of the questions you asked, you asked us to reflect on before we went into our discussion groups was, what is the role of God, the oppressor, and the oppressed? And we just kind of kept talking about God's role in this and going back and forth between, is God coming alongside enough? Maybe is a way to think about it. And because I think it's a big leap for some of us who've been taught to pray for liberation and to look for signs of liberation, to go, oh, but actually this is how God acts. God acts in helping you to survive. God acts in, suffering and surviving along with you. And so, yeah, I guess the kind of two, we put it in a binary because it's a basic way to start a conversation. Of course, it got much more nuanced, was basically, should the role of God, not necessarily should the role of God be to intervene, or should it be to come alongside and support and to guide?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, it almost comes down to like, what kind of God do we want, right? And I think Dolores Williams is a little more concerned with what kind of God we have. And by we, in her case, she's thinking largely of Black women in the US. But in a sense, and I mentioned this last night, in a sense, she is wanting to broaden her scope beyond just the lived experience of Black women. She sees this wilderness experience as a much more universal human like experience, and I think that was relevant in our conversation. Like we're mostly white folks at Harbor, and we have a lot of us have a lot of privilege. And so like when Dolores Williams thinks about a wilderness experience, she's stretching back to like her ancestors and like the horrors that were visited upon, enslaved people here in the US, and the modern day oppression, the continued oppression of people of color. For us, that's not the same crises. That's not the same wilderness experiences we're thinking of. But I have to say, like in our discussion group, there was very real stories of crisis, catastrophe. So it wasn't ranging from very real painful experiences, like you mentioned, of leaving a church, leaving a faith tradition, but also just death and loss and just a lot of really real things. And so, yeah, in those moments, to get back to your question, would I prefer God all the time to intervene in sort of supernatural ways that just bring about, whether it's healing or life or liberation and freedom and equality? Yeah, of course. I mean, of course I want that, right? But often I think what we find is that the survival theology, the womanist perspective, I think is much more resonant to my actual experience of living on this planet, which is that I do think God is present. But by my faith, I mean that's a belief that I hold, helping us, but it's just a little bit of help. And we're the ones who live and toil and struggle and fight, and and so yeah, I don't know. Those are some of my thoughts, but that is a really fascinating question, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think we landed there too, also acknowledging that, the frustration of wanting God to do more and more what we want God to do, what we want to have happen, and God not intervening in that way. Like there can be a frustration there, and that's a real and valid reaction. But yes, we landed, as we pointed out, I mean, they did get a well. So, there was a lot to think about. And I do think it's one of those theological questions that you can get really nerdy about, or it can become, but it also has real implications for how we have faith especially in times of crisis, when it's like, where are we looking for God in those moments? I want to ask you to summarize one more thing, which you brought in at the end, and I thought was so interesting, was how Dolores S. Williams talks about the appropriation of the Bible.
Yeah, so this is not something that I did like a deep dive on before the meeting, so maybe my bringing it up was ill-advised. But I just noticed in Sisters in the Wilderness, her kind of flagship book, where she establishes and builds out a ton of this theology, she continually refers to her work, her theological project with the Bible, as survival / quality of life African American Bible appropriation. That's the phrase that she keeps using. And Bible appropriation, even shorter, appears all the time in her writings. And I just found it interesting that I never see her say Bible interpretation, which is what we typically say when well, at least in the circles I've been in, when we've talked about working with the scriptures. So I don't know a ton about her specific thinking about why she's using that word, but my reading of her is that she is acknowledging, by using that word, she's acknowledging that this text is a concrete product that was produced at various specific times and places by people and people groups in very particular situations. When any person or group of scholars or whoever, a church, comes to this text from centuries later, from a continent away, when we have so much distance between ourselves and the text, what we are all doing is appropriating it. The word appropriation has now, today in 2024, a very negative connotation. We talk about cultural appropriation. I don't think Dolores Williams has any negative connotation in mind whatsoever when she uses the word appropriation in this way. I think she's just using it for the actual meaning of the word. You take something that was meant to be something else and you find out what use it has for you. So that's what she's doing in the survival theology and the womanist theology. She's saying this text was written by a bunch of men in the ancient Near East so long ago, responding to very particular moments and theologizing. It wasn't really meant for us now. I mean, it wasn't written with our context in mind. But are there things here that can give us life? Are there things here that can help us, that can guide us, that can help our own reflections on God and love and life? And if so, we take those things from the text, we figure out what they mean, and we use them in our own life. We're appropriating the wisdom that is in this ancient text. And so when Black women appropriate the text, they might do it in similar ways. And so they might have a shared theological approach like womanist theology. Other groups of people are doing the same thing. They just might not realize it. Our typical traditional male white Eurocentric theology that has kind of like carried the day for so long is also appropriating in all of its different expressions, but we act like that's just like regular theology. So I hope that kind of addresses, is that the topic that made your discussion room pull out its theological dictionaries? There was some talk of theological dictionaries in the other breakout room.
So no, appropriation was not what we looked up in the dictionary of theological terms. We were talking about the difference between theism and deism, which is the idea of deism being gods who are separate from humanity and just look down, and theism as a god who is part of it. But the fact that we pulled out a dictionary made me feel like really smart.
That's right. You're doing real
Really
important
grateful
work
to
in the
yes.
discussion group.
Yes, all for Jesus. Thank you so much. That was so helpful. I really appreciate the permission that Williams gives us in terms of appropriation. It's also a very old philosophical term about taking wisdom, taking learning, and making it part of your own experience of living. So I think that was a really important reminder for the way we all use the scriptures. And yeah. So next week, we are going to hear one more piece of Hagar's story. And we're going to continue on in this theme for the next few weeks. So everybody, you're welcome to join us any Thursday, 7 o'clock Eastern. You can sign up on our website. And John, good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thanks, Don.